Hi, my name is Jennifer Greaves, and I wanted to share with you the story of my granddad in honor of Remembrance Day. He served in World War II, and he was a seaman on the HMS Venetia for the Royal Navy. And he was aboard the Venetia on October 19th, 1940. And the reason that's notable is that's the day that the Venetia struck a mine and sunk about 12 miles offshore. And my grandfather went on later in life, and he decided to write about his experience of being on that ship as it went down. And it was remarkable to me because I knew nothing about it. Sadly, he passed away about 5 years ago. I had no idea he had written about his experience. And I've only just been able to see his writing on it in the last year. And it was so powerful and so moving to read and sort of feel what he was feeling at that time as he went down on that ship. And he spoke about, being in the water and being covered in fuel and just hoping that the ship didn't ignite as so many wrecks did. He spoke about he'd just finished his shift and he'd taken off his life belt. They didn't have life jackets back then. They had life belts. He'd taken off his life belt and he'd gone to run for another. And he credits that with saving his life because he was in a more fortunate part of the boat. And he spoke about just the haunting image of seeing one of his shipmates' faces in a portal in the ship as it was sliding below the water. Very, very hard things for somebody at the tender age of 21 to have experienced. For those of you who don't know me, I'm working on a book of poetry, and I thought, what better way to memorialize my granddad than to take his experience and put it into the lens of poetry. And so what I did was I tried to take some of his exact words. At one point in time in his writing, he says that while they were in the water, it seemed like a whole lifetime, and for some it was. So I used his exact wording there in my poem to try and capture what he was thinking. So this is my retelling of his firsthand account through poetry, and I called the poem HMS Venetia. Life had only begun with so much in store. He was just 21, another boy off to war. He lived by the sea, so the Navy made sense. A sailor he'd be in his country's defense. The Venetia, his ship, a destroyer class, on patrolling round trip to stop all who trespass. On that fateful morning, all seemed to be fine. There was no warning of the enemy mine. It was dropped in the night by a low-flying sortie in the early light, October 19th, 1940. Its diabolical purpose was to detonate just below the surface to seal a ship's fate. An explosion on impact cut through the silence. Their vessel attacked with a sickening violence. It happened so fast there wasn't a way to deploy the life rafts or send a mayday. A sudden realization and the terror he felt as he just left his station and removed his life belt. He ran for another, though he never did find, as he quickly discovered the ship misaligned. The horror of seeing his ship torn in two. No options for fleeing, no chance to pull through. The port side adrift, its image was haunting. It was sinking so swift, his prospects were daunting. A man below deck, whose fate was presumed, broadcast music to comfort the doomed. Holding on dearly to his fragment of ship, it listed severely, and he started to slip. With a sudden motion, his body took flight. Below him was ocean. He held on for his life. As if suspended in air, he clung to the deck. Then an answered prayer, he was grabbed by the neck. With a sudden force, a sailor named Brum hoisted him forth so he wouldn't succumb. No time to reflect, he had to decide what to do next to keep him alive. He leapt into the sea. The cold took his breath. The outcome would be surely his death. 12 nautical miles from any firm ground. There were no denials, his future unsound. A frantic poor soul locked eyes with his face through a sinking porthole, a scene he'd never erase. He bobbed in the waves and tread for survival amid watery graves, exhaustion his rival. The last of the vessel cut through like a knife, a picture he'd wrestle for the rest of his life. Fighting submission and covered in fuel, he prayed no ignition would end him so cruel. A sound in the distance, there were men yelling. He hoped for assistance from the sea that was swelling. A raft had blown free from the force of explosion. He swam through debris towards the commotion. With renewed hope intact of reaching the shore, he found the raft packed with no room for more. But salvation, it seemed, was yet to be found, for fate intervened with a way not to drown. Attached to the boat and randomly strewn were lifelines that float, giving him a pontoon. Attached to the lifeline, an hour and a half pause. It seemed a whole lifetime, and for some it was. Then off in the distance, a sight to behold, a sign of assistance and relief from the cold. Their convoy had returned to offer some aid. The desperate now yearned for a chance to be saved. The HMS Garth, a welcome addition, swiftly moved forth alongside their position. Unsure of their risk, scared a sub was to blame. Their actions were brisk, so not to end up the same. A net of great length was thrown over the side, and those with the strength climbed up for their lives. He grabbed at the rope with every ounce that he had, a glimmer of hope for what he wanted so bad. It took all of his might. His arms were a wreck. Just as he had no more fight, he was pulled onto the deck. Exhausted from dread, he laid in a heap, a silent prayer said for being saved from the deep. They lost 34 souls, 1/4 of the crew. Each one had goals and things left to do. They were all so young and they gave their lives, both those that died and the ones who survived. For years he would go to the lighthouse path at Plymouth Hoe to see the epitaph, a monument engraved with the names of his mates, that day they had braved with less fortunate fates. The times he'd attend, he'd gently stroke with his thumb the names of his friends, lingering longer on some. At Lieutenant Commander Craig, he'd stop and take note. A captain till the end, he went down with the boat. After the war ended, he went back to his life, to the country he defended, and married his wife. He then had 2 daughters. One was my mother. That man in the waters, he was my grandfather. His name was Eric Seymour, and he was lucky indeed to survive the cruel war, and so were we. He lived to his 97th, a hero, you'll agree. On November 11th, think of him for me, and all of the others who made a sacrifice so we all, one another, could live a peaceful life. He was one man, but there were so many more, so many affected by the atrocities of war. On the 11th of November, honor them well. We must always remember, so we don't live their hell, lest we forget.